What if I told you that the three kings that visited the baby Jesus were not kings at all? Not even wise men, but actually space wizards? What if I told you that these space wizards were the product of ancient prophecies that foretold their coming hundreds of years before? What if I told you that without these men, you, me, and most everyone you know would not even be here right now? Oh, and there were not three of them. This is Bible Unbound. Let's explore. Our story begins roughly 597 years before the Christ child is born. The Babylonian Captivity has decimated the Israelite landscape. Nearly 15% of the population is being forced to march across the arid Iraq desert to their new home in what was then Babylon. There, the Israelites had two options: assimilate or die. Notable biblical figures, in fact, choose to be killed, rejecting the worship of the Babylonians. Many died of old age, having been miraculously saved by the God of their fathers. For example, Daniel, who during this time was going head-to-head with the magicians of Nebuchadnezzar's court to determine the meaning of the king's royal dreams. The magicians all fail, where Daniel succeeds, but unlike Daniel's contemporaries, Daniel is killed by the later political ruler, Haman. The ever-present danger and volatile violence of the Babylonians is why most of the captive Israelites slowly began to fade into Babylonian culture, becoming indistinguishable from the Babylonians themselves. When miraculously, nearly 60 years after captivity, King Cyrus grants the Israelites the gracious decree to move back westward and rebuild their homeland. Thus begins the faithful exodus of the Israelites from Babylon, opening up a passageway that would not be closed for nearly 100 years. Even so, tens of thousands of Israelites choose to stay in the Babylonian country. Thus, the diaspora of Israel is formed. Stretching from every corner of the earth, Israelite communities begin to form and shape the culture they find themselves in, including the very culture of Babylon. So it is that nearly 500 years later, men are traveling from the east, vague remnants of the diaspora. These mysterious men are traversing the desert as well, captivated by another sort of king. You see, these men have been searching the Hebrew scriptures and are convinced that the star they see in the sky guiding them is the fulfillment of ancient prophetic voices that have been their guiding light for centuries. These men are, in the Greek, called Magi, the plural form of the word Magus, the root of the modern English word magic. Historians have come to realize that the men traveling by starlight to find the Christ who is being born were most likely a caste of Persian sorcerers who are referred to as Magi in other ancient historical sources. But we don't even need to look that far. If you were holding the Greek translation of the Old Testament in your hands right now, also known as the Septuagint, and you turned to the book of Daniel, you would see that Nebuchadnezzar's court of magicians and sorcerers were called Magi. Almost like out of a movie, priests in the ancient East would often specialize in particular areas of the occult, as people believed them to have nearly supernatural or magical powers given to them by the gods. In this case, it is most likely that the Magi traveling here were a branch of this priestly caste of sorcerers that would look to the stars into ancient prophecies of other religions to gather information about coming events. In modern language, we would simply call them astrologers. But to the ancient Near East, they might simply be known as space wizards. Sorcerers of the stars, looking to the heavens to discern life around them as the source of their prophetic powers. Of course, they would be called space wizards in Greek, or Magi. But who were these Magi specifically? Well, in the 8th century AD, there was a Latin translation of a Greek manuscript that details some world history and kingly lineages. This document was called the Excerpta Latina Barbari. Unfortunately, the translation is very poor. Much of the history is mythological, including the kings it highlights. This is the text translated into English. At that time, in the reign of Augustus, on 1st January, the Magi brought Jesus gifts and worshipped him. The names of the Magi were Balthasar, Melchior, and Githospa. When Herod heard that the king had been born, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When Herod realized that he had been tricked by the Magi, he sent out his murderers with orders to kill all the boys who were under 2 years old. Herod searched for John and sent his servants to Zechariah at the altar to say, "Where have you hidden your son? Do you not know that I have power to kill you and your lifeblood is in my hands?" Zechariah replied, "I am the witness of the living God. You can shed my blood, but God will receive my spirit." And Zechariah was killed in the morning. But here's the thing. There weren't 3 of them. We can't take the Latina Barbari with any historical sincerity. You see, in nativity scenes and plays, we allocate 1 Magi per gift that was brought. Matthew shows us the gifts they brought because they fulfill prophetic voices like the psalmist in Psalm 72:10, saying, "May the kings of Tarshish and the coastlands render him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring gifts." Or Isaiah, when he prophesies this event, "Caravans of camels will cover your land, young camels of Midian and Ephah, all of them coming from Sheba. They will carry gold and frankincense and proclaim the praises of the Lord." So, it would be more reasonable to assume that droves of caravans would have traveled far and wide to worship the boy being born with tributes like gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Of course, unlike the Magi, Matthew sees no occult prophetic significance in the star that they follow. After all, the stars are merely created entities, pointing us toward the creator of all things. Therefore, Matthew likely sees significance from Numbers 24:17. Here, Balaam prophesies, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. The star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the people of Sheth." The very scepter that Micah speaks of in his writings when he mentions the annihilation of the injustice of the nations, saying, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. They speak of the injustice that will be destroyed by the underdog. The scepter will rise out of the small rural town of Bethlehem, the meek scepter that will rule the nations. So it is that the nations are coming to Bethlehem." Remember, it's most likely that the Israelites in the land of Babylon merged with the cultic practices of these Magi hundreds of years ago. Therefore, these men might have been somewhat familiar with the passages above. But when they finally come to Herod the Great, they ask him where the child would be born. If they were Jewish, they would have been far more familiar with Micah's prophecy. But Matthew presents them as if they had never read it. That is why we can assume Matthew wants to make it as clear as possible. These cultic space wizards are, in fact, Gentiles, and God is using them powerfully to accomplish his means. When the Magi from the east arrive in Jerusalem, they went to King Herod and they said, "Where is he who is going to be born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was deeply disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. I wonder if all of Jerusalem is disturbed because 50 space wizards have just bounded across the desert in the hopes of forming what looks an awful lot like a coup d'etat. So Herod assembled all the chief priests and the scribes of the people and asked them where the Messiah would be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they told him, "because this is what was written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, because out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly summoned the wise men and asked them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. When you find him, report back to me so that I too can go and worship him." After this, the men leave Jerusalem and head for Bethlehem. When that night they saw the star again in the night sky. Miraculously, it seemed to move right over the top of where the child was born. They were overwhelmed with joy. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and falling to their knees, they worshipped him. And they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, fulfilling the prophetic announcement from the days of their ancient ancestors, people who they would not have known by name or culture. Now, it is worth noting the discussion surrounding when these men arrived to pay homage to the child. While some nativity scenes may depict the men there at the birth of the child, and others say it took them years to get there, church history tells us that the men visited the child 12 days after he was born. That is why, that 12 days after December 25th, the church celebrates the day of Epiphany, or Theophany, meaning manifestation, because it was on that day that the Christ became manifest in the hearts and lives of the Gentiles like he did into the world. Then, being warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, the Magi returned to their own country by another route. So I'm going to ask the question I think that we're all asking ourselves. What is Matthew doing? Why has Matthew brought in these dark, complex, interesting characters into his story? What is he doing, messing around with such strange people like the Magi? Well, without the Magi, I can almost guarantee that you, me, pretty much everyone would not be sitting here watching this video if it weren't for the Magi. And that's because the Magi fulfill a really specific prophecy that actually recurs throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. Namely, it's this prophecy that the Gentiles, the nations, will be entered into the kingdom of God. After all, the Magi are the first instance of the Gentiles that recognize that Jesus is God, at least the first instance that we see in the New Testament anyway. And so we really, despite their flaws, have no reason to find fault with these men, even if they had originally dedicated their lives to this misguided, unjust occult practice. You see, I opened my Paul video by saying that the Apostle Paul brought the gospel to a people who did not deserve it. And a lot of people get upset over that line, but honestly, it's true. Paul himself didn't even deserve the gospel. The Gentiles certainly don't deserve it. In the first century, Jewish people who would have been reading Matthew's gospel would have felt this all the more. To think that you deserve salvation is to miss, honestly, the whole point of the gospel. Then if you or I don't deserve salvation, then why do we think we can say that the Magi don't? In other words, if you or I can find Christ, if we can forsake our old sinful ways and worship him, then certainly a band of traveling space wizards can find Jesus too. And they do. Literally. So while this by no means implies that God endorses this sort of occult practice, it tells us that this is a God who is willing and able to meet people where they're at. And he will do whatever means necessary to bring glory to himself in his Son, in spite of the sin that you or I or space wizards commit. In this case, that glory is the reality that the entirety of the Old Testament prophecies are pointing us directly to Christ. The prophecy that the nations will bow in submission to this true and ultimate king. The prophecy that the Gentiles would be entered into this powerful, magnificent kingdom. The prophecy that God would not turn you away because of who you are or what you've done, because God desires that all kinds of people would be saved, even space wizards. Although, to put many of our minds at ease, translating the word Magi into kings is actually not a half-bad translation, especially thematically. After all, Matthew is trying to tell us that the Messiah, whom the world's kings will bow down to, the nations will be submissive to, is this true and ultimate king over other kings, over the nations, but particularly over the Gentiles. The kings are just figureheads of all of that. It's exactly why the Geneva Bible translates the word wise men into the first fruits of the Gentiles. I mean, really, it's because they are. They are our predecessors. They were the first of the New Testament to recognize that Jesus was king and not them. And they certainly didn't deserve his life. They didn't deserve his resurrection, his ascension, his forgiveness, the grace that he offers. And yet, even though he's just a little baby boy, they receive it. They herald this true, ultimate, and final kingdom back to their own nations. And so, kings, magi, space wizards, whatever you want, they are truly important, vital for our reading of the New Testament. And they show us that all of us, despite our sin, can be found by God. Hey, for those of you who have gotten to the end of this episode, I just want to say thank you and show you a very special new product that is totally free for patrons who are going to donate $50 or above. It's this exclusive Space Wizard hoodie that I'm wearing. This sweater may start some conversation, but after having watched this video, you have the explanation in your arsenal as to what this means. Space Wizards can find Jesus too. It's a great way not only to support the channel and wear some awesome merch, but also it's a great casual way to introduce people to the love and mercy of Jesus. The sweatshirt is also available, by the way, on our web store for $30, but supporting the channel is not about the sweater. That's just a sick bonus. Either way, both links are in the description. So that's all for today. Thanks for exploring with me. This was Bible Unbound. We'll see you next time.